Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today the topic we are discussing is fear and travel.
Yeah, and this is something that we've sort of touched base about on different episodes in a smaller area, but we really wanted to take the time to sort of delve into this topic a little bit deeper because it's something that's pretty real in our lives as we begin to plan a longer backpacking trip.
Yeah, so we've been back in Canada for the summer, and in the fall we are looking at going to Asia and spending the majority of our year backpacking around there while
living and working and being podcast hosts, of course.
Yeah, so it's something that's come up so many times on the podcast where we talk to people who have gone to places like Mexico, South America, India, things like that, where people who have before their trip felt a lot of anxiety, a lot of worries about, am I actually going to be safe here? Can I feel comfortable in this place? And then a few months later, when they're done their trip, they're like, oh yeah, it was totally safe. It was totally fun. I feel a little bit crazy for being so anxious at the start.
Yeah, it was really interesting talking to Hunter Stanford, who we talked to a couple different times on the podcast, once while he was traveling and then once he was home, and just hearing how he had this kind of terror about going to Mexico. I mean, as a Canadian or an American, you really hear these horror stories about, Canadians getting poisoned to death in hostels or getting kidnapped, or Americans getting taken never to be seen again. And that can be really fear-inducing, where it's how much do I actually love my life? Is it worth it to be YOLO, I'll go there and have this great experience? Or is it my life is kind of worth more than putting myself in this potentially dangerous situation?
Yeah, and I think this is a big thing when you're talking to people who maybe aren't travelers themselves. So when we talk to people who have been to Southeast Asia, and we're like, oh yeah, we're thinking about going there, we've been considering the Philippines. They're like, oh cool, I haven't been there myself, but I've had friends who've gone, X place is cool. Versus talking to someone who's just a parent or someone who's just been working, the only thing they know about is what they've heard on the news. So you talk to someone and they're like, oh hey, isn't that where people got beheaded recently?
Yeah, and I think that just to give more context for that, I mean, that did happen to you. That wasn't the exact conversation that happened to you yesterday, I think it was. And it's something that it's hard because we, as people who are experienced travelers, know that what is in mainstream media is not always what's true about an entire country, but it's also hard when you hear this story that is we don't want our heads chopped off. We don't want to get kidnapped and have somebody cut off our heads. That sounds terrible.
But yeah, people hear things on the news, and so your only impression of places, it becomes kind of the news stories you hear about it. And news stories obviously aren't going to cover things that are uninteresting or... I mean, we've talked on the podcast before about how, there's no news stories about man has pleasant day. It's man is beheaded, man is kidnapped, man is poisoned.
Yeah, and it's not even man has pleasant day. It's two Canadian backpackers go to Thailand and have an amazing trip. You don't hear about all the people from around the world who have that experience, which is thousands and thousands. You hear about, the one group of people who has a bad experience, or the one person who gets food poisoning and dies in their hotel room, and it's oh my god, I'm gonna get food poisoning and die in my hotel room, I should not go. Yeah,
so you have that one issue that the news and media spreads negative news more so than positive news, but also that negative anecdotes travel farther than positive anecdotes. So friends of friends of friends who got robbed, you might hear about, but you don't hear about friends of friends who had a good time.
I mean, in a social circle, do you think that that's necessarily 100% true? I think that maybe it travels further and becomes more viral if it's a bad thing, but I think that we've had lots of experiences where we've heard positive experiences, because I feel it's usually word of mouth that convinces me that it is okay to go somewhere.
Yeah, no, but I just think that negative stories or stories about robberies or something like that, it's more exciting, so that anecdote travels farther than positive ones.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I hear what you're saying, and I think there's definitely some, like, validity and truth to that. It's interesting even when you're in a hostel, like, sometimes you get these, like, crazy stories that get passed down from person to person in the hostel room, and it's always interesting. It's like, oh, be careful, like, so-and-so had this happen to them. Personal example of that is when we were in Vietnam in Nha Trang, and we heard that it was kind of like a city that lots of people get robbed in because there's a lot of tourists and young people going out to the bars and stuff. And so we went out one night, we were super cautious, didn't really bring anything of value. And a guy that was in our group got separated, and then the next day we see him, he's like black and blue. Somebody had robbed him and punched his face in and stolen his camera. And
Hadn't punched his face in.
Well, punched his face, whatever. And it was just interesting to, experience that and then firsthand pass that story kind of down. Like, I feel like I've told that story quite a few times.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good example where, like, we told that story way more than we've told stories about pleasant experiences in Vietnam.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's kind of one of the only crazy bad experiences I think we had in all of Southeast Asia. And there's, people talk about a lot of stuff that goes down, and even if you go on, like the Travel Canada advisory website would say to exercise like high degree of caution for almost any of the countries in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, so we've had, our experience has always been, and I think everyone we've talked to has been, it's a lot easier to make yourself feel anxious beforehand. So when we went to Colombia, for example, we felt pretty nervous, and we were like, is it going to be safe to travel there? It turns out extremely safe. And so also, like, people like Hunter we've talked to, Rory going to India, feeling kind of the same anxiety beforehand and then feeling fine afterwards.
Rory even with South America.
Yeah.
I remember, like, one of the first times I talked to Rory before he decided to go on this trip where he was going to start in Mexico. We joked around about how, he'd always said, like, yeah, I want to go, like, travel Canada and the U.S. before I go, like, more south because I'm probably going to get kidnapped and have all my shit stolen. So I want to have experienced Canada and the U.S. before that.
But so given that a lot of times it seems like the fear beforehand isn't valid, how do you go about making safety decisions before traveling somewhere? Like, obviously there's places where you don't want to travel because it's really genuinely not safe.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Like, how do you decipher between what is truly unsafe and what is been deemed unsafe by, like, the government website, but is actually probably pretty safe to travel? And I think that doing research is the biggest thing, talking to people who've had firsthand experiences there, and not just talking to one person, talking to more than one person. And I think with that, something that's key for me is talking to somebody who travels similarly to me. And the reason why I say that is, like, I take anything that sort of like my parents say about somewhere with a grain of salt. Like, if they're like, oh yeah, we went there and it was like so dirty and so gross and the food was terrible, and I'm like, well, we don't really travel the same, so I'm probably going to get a second opinion on that place.
So kind of going to the people who might have been there first.
Yeah, I think that for me, that's my first step. And sometimes it's easy to be like, oh, I don't know anyone who's been there, but with social media, your network's actually a lot bigger than you might think it is. So maybe you're thinking about going to Myanmar or China or something you can't think of, like a really close friend off the top of your head. Maybe put a call out on Facebook that's like, hey, I'm thinking of going here. Who's been there? What do you think about that? And the reason why I say going to your network first and asking people that you know is because it's not just putting a search into Google and getting like all this broad stuff that's coming up. It's turning to somebody that you already know and perhaps have a relationship with and have some sort of trust in for them to tell you what their experience was like. Because I think that a Google search about Colombia would come up with a probably different results than what I would tell somebody. Does that make sense? Yeah,
that does make sense. I think that you get a good feel for how safe a place is from going. And I think that another thing that's important is that you once you arrive somewhere, you kind of learn, like, each place has a little bit of a different culture towards staying safe. Like, the people who live somewhere will have figured out how to stay safe, but sometimes that's hard to find. So, like, going to Colombia, for example, like, you learn pretty quickly that you just have to be aware of your possessions, because if you aren't, someone will take them. Or when you get to Buenos Aires, for example, people are like, don't go here at night. Yeah. Because you will get robbed. So I guess the question is, like, when you're making decisions, though, how do you decide, like, where is somewhere that's too dangerous for you and where is somewhere that just appears to be dangerous, or even from the outside has, like, a bit of anxiety-inducing news stories about it?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one thing for us is people who have, like, a lot of friends who have traveled. I think that if I don't know anybody who's like been there, then it might be somewhere that I need to, like, think twice about. But for people who are maybe listening who are like, well, what if I don't have, a bunch of Facebook friends who traveled the world? I think that going on Google and, like, doing some searches, like reading some blogs, I guess looking into, like, the Travel Canada or Travel US or Travel United Kingdom. I think, though, like, I was on there the other day because we're currently, like, planning a trip. And I know it was, like, it said there was a moderate advisory for Peru. And, like, if somebody asked me, is Peru safe to go to? Definitely.
Well, so I think there's, like, a number of problems with that stuff. Like, looking at places dividing places as a country, I think, isn't necessarily helpful for safety, because usually, like, there'll be areas of the country where it's, like, extremely poor, more rural, and you might not be safe in those areas, but, like, the cosmopolitan hub is, like, very first world. So I think you see, like, for example, if you took a city like Shanghai in China, that's, like, basically a first world city. And then, but there's a lot of other poor areas where it's probably a lot more dangerous. But then also thinking about what's a safe place, what's a not safe place to go, it depends so much on, like, the group of people you're traveling with.
Yeah.
Because if you're traveling with, like, you're a male and you've got, like, 2 male friends, and, like, the 3 of you are going to go somewhere, like, you can probably go a lot more places than you would want to go as a solo female traveler. And it would also depend on what you're doing. Like, if you're into photography and have a big ass camera, the places you might want to go, your threshold, and you don't want to get your camera stolen, are different than, like, if you're, a dude who's kind of doesn't have much stuff and is willing to go wherever, because it's not going to be a big deal.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I know that's something that we talked to Rory about the last time that we talked to him. So just a couple episodes ago is that he booked a tour for India, and looking back on India, he's like, yeah, being, like, a single dude would be no problem in India. And I know that, off the recorder, me and him talked quite extensively, and he's like, I think that I would probably, like, go with somebody else if I were you. Like, I probably wouldn't go as a solo female, especially, like, a young solo female. And so that's definitely something to consider as well. And I know I have a friend right now who's in the process of planning a trip to South America, and she was asking me about places that would be, okay for her to go by herself. And I think that the things that I told her were a little bit different than I would tell a group of dudes going, or even, like, a solo guy going, because you do have to be aware of things a little bit differently based on if you're by yourself, if you're male or female, if you're a couple, if you're a family. Because, having kids adds, like, a whole other element to that.
Your tolerance for danger is way lower if you have a family.
But what would you say, what would your answer to that question be? So, like, how do you decide what's too dangerous for you to go to and what's, like, within the realm of being safe? You kind of cringed at the, like, government website suggestion that I put out there briefly.
Yeah, so the problem with those is, like, I think they tend towards being anxiety inducing. It's like, oh yeah, just, like, don't go unless you need to go. I think that so much of safety depends on your behavior somewhere, so that there are ways to be safe almost anywhere. So first of all, you have this issue where your perceptions of anywhere in the world are going to be slightly skewed by the information you get about those places. So, like, places where there have been, beheadings or terror attacks, like, that's the only thing you have, so that's the association you have to that word. And it takes a long time for associations to change. That's why you see a place like Colombia, which is actually probably seems a lot safer on the ground compared to Peru, but people have better associations with Peru because if you're old, you're more likely to have had friends who went to Machu Picchu than you are who have gone to Colombia.
If you're old. You're discriminating against our older listeners?
No. I don't mean it that way, but like, if you have... It takes a long time to change associations. So if your source are like news/friends, and your friends go to Machu Picchu, but they don't go to Colombia, and your news tells you bad stuff about Colombia all through the 80s and the 90s, that's going to change your association with that place. Okay, yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. I think that it's really, really important. Like, so my first piece of advice was like, go to your friends, like check in with your networks and your like immediate resources. I think it's always good to do your own research though. I think that's something I would definitely recommend when it comes to like choosing a place and figuring out the safety. Like, I always read like a number of different websites and blogs. Like, I'll kind of start with like the basic Wikipedia page where it might have some like generic, maybe extreme information. And then I'll go into like other people's blogs and like other resources and that sort of thing to really get a feel for, on like different levels, a place. Yeah, and I think that it's important to take what you're hearing from any one person with kind of a skeptical attitude, because so much anecdotal information is just coincidence. Like, someone might have had really good weather when they went somewhere and that made them feel good about it, or they had bad weather, or they stayed at a great hostel and they've generalized a whole city based off that hostel stay, or a whole country based off a few cities. So being weary about that.
It's something that I think about even with the way that we talk about Colombia, because you and I had such a great experience with Colombia, and I know that the reactions that we got when we were telling people we were going to Colombia was just like so extreme. Like, I went in to like change my car insurance down to just like fire theft and vandalism while my car was sitting while we were gone. And the woman's like, oh yeah, like, where are you going in South America? Like, Peru? And I was like, oh, we're starting in Colombia. And she was like, oh, like, Colombia? And I was like, yep, like, the only Colombia in South America. And she was like, oh. Like, it was kind of like, do you want some life insurance too? And you got the same thing, like, boarding your plane from Kelowna. It was like, you're going to Bogota? Like, nobody goes to Bogota. Like, see you never type thing.
Yeah.
And when we got down there, it was just like we had no plans. We weren't sure how long we were going to stay. We're like, let's just like feel it out and get like the vibe for the country. And we loved it so much that we didn't really want to leave. And well into our travels, we were like, oh, maybe we should just like go back. Maybe we should have never left Colombia, because Colombia was so great. But it's also something that like we had really good experiences because we were cautious. Like, we didn't walk at night with our expensive belongings and our passports, and we were cautious when we went out in like maybe a dangerous area, and we tried to avoid the dangerous areas. And I think that that's something I try to tell people if people ask about it. But I think too, it can come across like when they're like, oh, is Colombia dangerous? I'm like, no, Colombia's fine. But it's like, Colombia can be dangerous.
Yeah, and so that's the big thing that I kind of was getting towards, is that like, your behavior anywhere you go is really going to influence your safety. Like, obviously there's random stuff that's dangerous, and certain places have more random dangers to worry about, like bombings, for example. But a lot of places, it's just being receptive to different cultural rules about how to stay safe, and then like actually applying those rules to your behavior. Like, if you act the same way you do in Calgary, Alberta, in Bogota, Colombia, like, you're probably going to run into problems. Like, you don't want to be walking around at 3 a.m. by yourself if you're drunk, or leaving your bag by a bench in the park while you like take a snooze, or or like leaving your belongings on the beach and walking away somewhere. Like, people are just going to take them.
Yeah, and it's something, I mean, we're recording at a beach in like Naramata, British Columbia, which is like a small town in the Okanagan that Ryan grew up in, and I'm just like looking around us, and there's a dude out doing some lane swimming, and he's left all of his belongings just on the beach. And that's like a totally legit, safe thing to do here. Nobody's going to take it. But that's something that you really need to be aware of when you're in a place like Brazil is a really good example of that. Like, I remember when we were in Rio doing like some research on the safety there, and it's like, okay, it can be really dangerous depending on where you are, but it is really safe. But one thing is that people actually like wander up and down the beach just waiting for things like that to happen, waiting for people to leave their shit so they can take it. And just knowing like the different cultural things from place to place, like that's something that you really need to be aware of in some places.
Yeah, and then so the question isn't really like necessarily is X country safe, but it's how to stay safe in X place. So you kind of take control of looking up how would you stay safe that place, and then if the answer to that is like, oh, hire a driver the entire time you're there, and like, stay in a compound. If that's the answer, be like, yes, it's probably not safe in that place. But if the answer is as simple as, going out with your belongings at night, staying in after like midnight, then you're probably going to be fine safety-wise.
Or even as simple as like, I know in Peru, when I was there the first time with a girlfriend, we had like sort of a dude that kind of followed us, and at one point he kind of went into her big bag on an outside pocket just while we were standing at a light, and we were both pretty aware that he was kind of like around there and being a bit creepy. But it's like, you don't put stuff that's valuable on the outside. Like, I think she had some like dirty tissues or something like that. And just knowing that people might try stuff like that in some places, and being proactive about it, being prepared. Like, something we've said time and time again on the podcast is we were always prepared to get robbed. That was kind of our thing in South America, is like, when we went out at night, we were going out prepared to get robbed.
Yeah, and then so another aspect of this, I think, is maybe not necessarily about safety, but like comfort level. So it's something we've talked about with going to Southeast Asia, or something we talked about with Rory, about if you're going somewhere and you're feeling this anxiety about going there, you're like, it seems so chaotic and crazy and unsafe. Like, I don't know if I'm going to feel comfortable. Doing something like a tour at first is a great way to kind of ease into a place like that. Like, you get someone who's handled the logistics of your first couple weeks, and then that person probably also is going to be a bit more expert on the rules you need to follow to stay safe. So doing something like booking a tour the first 2 weeks on your India trip, or if you've never been outside of the country and you're going to go off to Bangkok, booking like a 1 week tour or something like that is a great way to kind of ease into your comfort zone.
Totally. And it's something that we flew from Greece, which was about as like sort of third worldy as we got in Europe, and we flew over to Bangkok, and Greece like certainly did not prepare us for Southeast Asia. And I remember like being jet lagged and being overwhelmed and just being like, oh, I wish we had somebody to kind of like show us the ropes of how to do things as simple as cross the street or make a decision about where to eat, because there's this fear of getting sick, and there's this fear of getting your stuff stolen, and there can be a lot of like really uncomfortable things, like things that you're just not used to when you're at home, and you've got your favorite restaurants and your local coffee shop, and you don't have to worry about if a restaurant's like using the tap water to wash dishes. Yeah.
And so I think the final point for me is just not being afraid to ask dumb questions when it comes to safety. Once you have arrived at somewhere, or even before when you book your hostel and you've got an email address there. I know sometimes like we felt a bit dorky walking into a hostel and being like, oh, is it like safe to go out at night? And they're like, look at us like we're dumb. And they're like, yeah, of course it's safe to go out at night. But I think that it's easy to kind of give into this like, oh, I need to be tough and cool and not ask a question like that. But it's really helpful to get information you need to know on how to stay safe. So always pushing through that kind of social insecurity and asking questions about were there any areas of town I should avoid or stuff like that?
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with that. And I know that that's something like we get listeners who reach out to us on the podcast from time to time, and people are asking things like, you know, is it safe to go here? Because they know we've been there, and really using like the people you know who have been to places to ask them things like that, because I don't really think it's like about being cool when it comes to like your passport and your laptop and, you know, like all the possessions on your back, or maybe even your life. Like, it's really important to keep yourself safe and to make sure that you're feeling comfortable, because I think that that's like comfort within the discomfort, because I think that that's something that we've sort of experienced before, is people sort of, I think like people who are sort of in the profession of stealing stuff kind of can like read that sort of thing. Like they can kind of like interpret when you're feeling uncomfortable or unsafe. Does that make sense to you? Like, do you understand what I'm trying to say with that?
Well, I don't know about interpret when you're feeling unsafe, but I think that kind of hints at the point of just like not making yourself an easy target and knowing how to act in a place makes you a lot more safe.
Yeah, definitely. And so then just coming back around to, we've talked a lot about like being safe and travel and tying it back into fear, because I think there can be a lot of fear when you're at home and you like don't know what a place is going to be like, and all you know is what you see in mainstream media, is like really getting away from the overall like bigger sort of like stereotypes of a place and seeing if you can find out different information or really like cross-check the information you're getting. Because something that we've really realized is like, as we're planning for this Asia trip, is like, you know, we're talking about Manila and we're like, oh, well, Manila would be cool. There's a cool conference there that we kind of want to go to. And then, you know, Ryan's like, but somebody got beheaded. And I'm like, yeah, but if we like...
Well, I didn't say that.
Well, no, you didn't say it originally, but you said it to me yesterday, like, oh, like, some Canadians got beheaded. And I'm like, well, if we, like, live our lives based on that, like, we would never go anywhere. Right? Like, if you live your life based on...
where Canadians have been beheaded?
No, based on, that's not what I mean. I mean, if you take the one piece of mainstream media that can be really scary and can make you fear for your life or fear to go to that place, you may never travel. Like, I think that there's enough information about a bunch of different countries that are really cool that if you're constantly just like, no, somebody got beheaded here, somebody got really like sick and died here, like somebody got their shit stolen here, like you would never leave your home country.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's good to think about, is just the nature of statistics about these things. So you could probably go look up crime statistics for these countries, and like homicide rates, things of that nature, and get a like actual sense for what the real risks are, because the anecdotal news stories kind of mislead you.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to even compare that to maybe like where you live. Like, if you are somebody who's American who's listening, maybe you're a friend from Atlanta, like look up the crime rates in Atlanta versus the crime rates where you're going to go, because sometimes it's easy to forget that like shit happens in our own backyard, shit happens in our own cities, and we become really disconnected from it because we know what's safe, we know what's not safe kind of in the place that we live. Like, you know, when we were in Atlanta, for example, we lived in like South Buckhead, which is a nice, pretty like safe area, and we knew the areas that we didn't really want to go in. And so when I hear about things that happen in Atlanta and people are like, oh, Atlanta, it's so unsafe, I'm like, well, it's not really. It's just about being safe within that city, finding the places that are safe, being smart when you're out at night, especially if you're by yourself. And I think that the same goes for other cities in the world and other countries in the world.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I feel like we've covered the topic pretty well. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I mean, if anyone has any questions or comments, or is thinking about planning a trip right now and is sort of experiencing the same thing, definitely reach out to us. We're always happy to hear from you, answer questions, hear what you have to say. If you have any, you know, points that you want to add to this sort of topic in general, we would love to hear from you. It's info@theworldwanders.com.
Till next time.
Thanks. We really hope that you enjoyed that episode of the podcast. And if you like the podcast and you want to support us in creating more high quality episodes, you can visit www.patreon.com/theworldwanders. A little goes a long way. And thanks in advance for your support.
To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at WorldWanderers1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.